I've got here just a screenshot of a short form that includes a list of kids here on the right. One thing I find is that people get confused about the distinction between fields and lists. And in this one sentence here, I have several fields. Signer is a text field. This number sign here is a count field referring to the number of items in the list. Here's a pronoun field assigning a pronoun to the number of items in the list. And then here's the list itself, and the list contains fields within it. The distinction here is keep in mind that fields will give you information about a list. Here's a field giving information about the number of items in the list. And the list itself gives you the contents of the list. And I'll come back to that concept a couple of times. Fields referring to information about a list, lists referring to the contents of a list. Now, taking a closer look at this list here, every list is divided up into 3 clauses. And here I've marked the separating elements red so that we can see where each clause begins and ends. Think of the clauses as the first clause, middle clause, and last clause, rather than thinking of them as clause number 1, 2, and 3. And the reason for that is because if your list consists of, say, 5 items, that middle clause is going to be repeated 3 times. The first clause will be used once for the first item. The last clause will be used once for item number 5 in that list. Now I'm going to move into an actual document here, and we'll create some lists, especially some custom lists. This document for shareholder minutes has several lists in it. This first one is a pretty basic list. It just needs to list all the names of the shareholders. I've got in my, oh, here's something I wanted to show you. In Word, as you're working in a form, you might want to make use of Word's split screen feature. Up here, if you can see my mouse near the top right corner, there's a tiny little hyphen button here in the Word screen. If I click and drag on that, I can split my Word screen into 2 sections. And at the top section, aiming at the body of the document, and in the bottom section, I can scroll down to my Q&A table, and I can keep that visible while I'm working in the top section. That's a great tool for form creators who want to be able to look at the Q&A table at the same time as the body of the document. So now that I've done that, we can see I've got a question in my Q&A table, which gives me a list of shareholders. And up here in my form, I'm going to insert a list. Right here, I click the list button. And I'll just go with my standard tic-tac-and-toe format here as a starting point. There's my list, and here's my first clause, my second clause, and my third clause. I'm going to color these so that it's obvious what's going on as I play with this form. I'm going to make the first clause red, and the last clause blue. And since the middle one is between red and blue, I'm going to color that one purple, just for demonstrative purposes here. So when I click the fill button, notice I've got 4 items in my list, and according to what I said before, we should end up with that middle clause, the purple clause, repeated twice. The final clause is used for the last item in my list, no matter how many items are in my list. The first clause is used for the first item in my list. So if I remove a couple items from my list, I will get rid of Artie and Betty here. And then I'm hearing some music through my speaker here. Bob, are other people hearing this music too, do you know? I'm not hearing Bob either. I'm going to proceed, and if you can hear the music on your end that I'm hearing, let's just enjoy it and
I think
call it background music.
I think it's fine, Scott. I don't think it's playing out to the audience.
Now it seems the music is gone. I hope you can still hear me all right. Bob, are you still there with us? I'm not sure if Bob is or not, but I'm going to proceed on the assumption you can still hear me all right. So here I've narrowed down my list to just 2 people here, and I will click the fill button to fill this in again. And now the middle item, the middle clause, the purple one, has been removed completely because there are no middle items in my list. So that's just the logic of the clauses. Now I'm going to move on to some more elaborate lists here. I'll reset the form. And here I have the number of shareholders. That's not a list, that's a field because it's information about the list. How many items are in the list? So instead of clicking my list button, I click my field button. Insert a field. This is a count field, and that'll give me a number of items. I'm going to click the fill button just so that we can see how that turns out. 2 shareholders. If I wanted that to be a word instead of a number, I can just go back into my field screen and change that to a word type field. Now I'll click fill, we'll see the result, and now it's formatted as a word instead of numbers. Here we get into what is going to be our first custom list. I want a list of shareholders, and each shareholder gets their own paragraph, which includes several fields. The way to build a custom list is to start with one of the default lists and then modify it. So I'm going to make a blank space for myself here, and I'm going to start with just an empty default list. I'll use that. I won't use the first one this time. This one time I'll use this repeating paragraphs as my default list. The nice thing about that one is if every clause in my list is identical, this format makes a shorter, easier to read list. I'll click done there because all I have to fill in is this first. Hold on one moment. I'm going to see. It looks like I have a problem with the audio here. 1 second. All right, Bob. Oh, good. It sounds like you can still hear me. The problem was I lost my connection to Bob, but now that's back. Okay, so returning here, where did I leave off? Oh, since I've used this format, whatever I type as the first clause here is going to be repeated. That's why it says ditto in my second clause, and it's also going to be repeated in the third clause. It saves me a little trouble creating the form because I only have to create 1 clause instead of all 3. And what I want to appear in that first clause is going to be basically this sentence here. So I'm going to copy this sentence and I'm going to paste it into my list, replacing the first clause. Paste, like so. Now I'm going to get rid of the old material that I'm replacing so that it doesn't confuse me. And I'm going to click the fill button just to see where I stand so far. And I can see that I'm getting a separate paragraph for each item in the list. That's good. I'll hit reset. The first field I'm going to insert into this clause will be the name of the shareholder. That's the simplest one. For that, I'm going to extract an item in the list and plug it into my resulting list. So I'll click the field button, and I will insert field. And notice that I have a new choice here that I didn't have before, this item in list choice. That appears because my cursor is sitting inside a list, and it means instead of just grabbing information about the list, I can actually grab the contents of the list. So I'll click item in list. I want to grab one of the items in the list. Text item is fine. I'll click done. And notice that this field I created is the same one that appears when I use any of my default list settings. That's going to pull in an item from the list. I'll click fill just so we can see the results so far. And so that's pulling in Carla for the first item and Doug for the second item. I'll click reset. The next field I'm going to add here is this one. I want a reference to a number to indicate which item this is. It'll say the first shareholder is Carla, the second shareholder is Doug, and so forth. So again, I'll insert a field. Again, it's referring to an item in the list, but this time instead of giving me the text for the item, I want it to give me a sequential number for that item. 1 for the first item, 2 for the second item, and so forth. That gives me this field code. I'll show you what that looks like when I fill it in. This is starting to look better. The 1 shareholder is Carla, the 2 shareholder is Doug, but I want that to be a word instead of a numeral. I'll reset, and I'll change the format of that field by clicking on the field button. And instead of being a numeral, I'm going to make it a word, an ordinal word with a TH at the end. And I'll fill that so you can see how it looks. Now it says first and second, the way I want it to. Another way people use those sequential numbers is sometimes they'll use that to create their paragraph numbering. I can copy this number field here and paste it at the beginning of the clause with a period and a tab after it. And I'll format this one as a numeral field, choose a number format, and then I get some nice paragraph numbers assigned to my list items. I've got a phone ringing here, but I'm going to ignore that. And the last thing I'm going to deal with here is a number of shares. I'll hit reset. This is a piece of information that we haven't asked for in the Q&A table yet. I want to know the number of shares owned by each shareholder. So down in my Q&A table, I'm going to add another question. I'll call it shares held. And how many shares does each shareholder own? And here I'm going to use a special type of a smart answer that you might not have used yet, called a linked list. I'll click the smart answer button. And I want a linked list because I want to ask for additional information about every one of the people listed up here in the shareholders question. So I turn on my link to another list checkbox, and the only choice I have here is shareholders, so I'll choose that. And that's going to give me, for everyone listed in the shareholders question, a text box where I can type some information for each one, and it'll be the number of shares for each one. That creates this smart answer. I'll go ahead and fill it in as a form user. Let's say Carla owns 60 shares and Doug owns 40 shares. And given that new piece of information now, I can add this final field to my list, which will be the number of shares. So I'll click Field, Shares Held. That's an item in the list. And I want it to just be the text of the field, the 60 or the 40, rather than a sequential number. I'll fill it in so you can see how it looks. Here we have Carla with 60 and Doug with 40. I'm going to do one more thing to make this a little more attractive. I'll copy this shares held field and paste it here. I'll use it first as a numeral, first as words, and then in parentheses, I'll use the numeral. So this one here I'm going to change to a word format, which is one of my choices on the list here. And I'll click Fill. And there's our end result. To make it a little more exciting, I'm going to add one more person to my list here. Let's put Bill on there. I'll click Refresh to update my linked list. And let's say Bill has 10 shares. I'll click Fill again. Notice that I reused basically the same field here to give the word first and the numeral 1. And over here I used the same field to give the word 60 and the number 60. I just formatted it differently. Next up, down here, the shareholders present at the meeting. Here I want another list, but it's going to be a smaller list. I'll hit Reset to give us a starting point. Here I want to indicate only the people who showed up at the meeting. It's not going to be the full list of shareholders, which is up here. It's going to be a smaller list of shareholders. And I'll show you a handy trick for creating such a thing. Down here, I'm going to add one more question to my Q&A table. I'll call it attendees. Who attended the meeting? And rather than make them enter some names again, I want to reuse the names that they already used above. So I'm going to create a smart answer, which instead of asking for a fresh list with this, instead I'm going to ask the user to make a choice. I'm going to have them choose from the list I already have in the form of shareholders, and I'm going to allow them to make a multiple choice. That gives me a series of checkboxes in my smart answer that looks like this, so that they can say, well, Carla showed up at the meeting and Bill showed up at the meeting, and that's all. It's a subset of the list that appears earlier. And here in the form, I can just put in a new list, and instead of choosing shareholders, I'll choose attendees. And now when I fill in the form, I get my full list of shareholders here, full list of shareholders here, and here I just get my subset list of the attendees. The last thing I'm going to show you with custom lists is something called previous, current, next, first, and last indicators. It'll make more sense when I get into it here. I'm going to close this document. And here I've got a will, which includes this paragraph. I appoint somebody as my personal representative. If that person refuses or is unable to serve, then I appoint another person in his or her place. If that person refuses, I appoint another person, and so on and so forth, however many personal representatives are listed here. The weird thing about this is that in this clause, I need to refer not only to a personal representative, but I also need to refer to the previous personal representative. And I'll show you how that's done. I'm going to make a little space here for myself to insert a default list format, list of personal representatives. And then I'm going to pretty much just tear it apart and replace it with what I want. But I started with this because it gives me the starting code, it gives me the little separator codes, and it gives me the closing bracket code there so that I don't have to try and create those on myself, on my own. So the content of the first clause here is going to be this first sentence. I appoint somebody as my personal representative. I'm selecting that, copying it. I'm including the spaces at the end of the sentence, and I'll paste it right here in my first clause. The second clause is going to be this sentence. If the previous person refuses, then I appoint the second person in his or her place. I'm copying that, and I'm going to delete the old second clause and paste in that second clause. The third clause is going to be identical to the second clause, so I'll just paste that in a third time. And that's the bones of my list. I will delete this paragraph so it's not distracting me. And I can start now inserting the fields. The first one's pretty easy. Here in the first clause, I want a field that refers to the first person in the list. So I click Field, Insert Field. This is an item in list field, and text is fine. It's going to be a person's name. I appoint somebody as my personal representative. I'm going to copy that field and also place it here in the second clause. That's where I'll be referring to the next person who's serving as a personal representative. And I'll paste it here in the third clause. That's where the last person who serves as a personal representative is going to appear. Before we go any further, I'm going to fill this in just so you can see what we've got so far. So here's my first person in the list. Here's my second person in the list. Here's my third person in the list. All three clauses are accounted for here. If I had more people in my list, I'll add a fourth. Let's say Joe is the fourth person in the list. Then when I fill it in, I'll get my middle clause repeating itself. So here's my middle clause showing up once, and my middle clause showing up again. Everything's working so far. I'm resetting the form. Now here, in the middle clause, I want to refer to the person in the previous clause. That's the tricky part. So if this person refuses, then the next person. I'll insert a field. This is an item in list field. And instead of referring to the current person in the list, I want to refer to the previous person in the list. Anytime you're inserting a field in a list, you can refer to the current item or one of the other items. You have a choice of previous, next, first, or last. I'll choose previous here. Notice that it puts a number P in the field code instead of number X. X refers to the current item, P refers to the previous item, or N refers to next, F refers to first, L refers to last. Now that I've got a field that refers to the previous item, I'm going to copy that and I'm going to paste it where it's also needed here in the third clause, because in the third clause I also want to refer to the previous item in the list. I'll click the fill button so you can see the results. I appoint Ann as my personal representative. If Ann, the previous person, refuses, then I appoint Bill. If Bill, the previous person, then I appoint Carrie, and if Carrie refuses, then I appoint Joe. The last thing to deal with is this his/her pronoun. I'll reset. And what I want here is a pronoun field which refers not to the current item in the list, but to the previous item in the list. So I'll insert a field. This is an item in the list field. This one is a pronoun field, a little different than what I did before. And I want it to refer to the previous item in the list. Done. The default pronoun field is he, she, but I actually want this to be his, her. So I'm going to fine tune it a bit. I'm going to go back into my field screen, which now has an option for his, her, right there. And I'll choose lowercase. Having created that, I'm just going to copy it and put it here in my third clause because I need the exact same field there. This should work perfectly now. I'll click fill. I appoint Ann. If Ann refuses, I appoint Bill to serve in her place. If Bill refuses, I appoint Carrie to serve in his place. If Carrie refuses, I appoint Joe to serve in her place. So everything's matching up correctly. And that's about all I'm going to cover for custom lists.